Dr. Sarah Miller had always prided herself on her observation skills. As Harvard's youngest tenured professor of xenobiology at 32, those skills had served her well. But today, on a crisp October morning, she found herself being the subject of someone else's study. It started with a shimmer in the corner of Starbucks. Most people might have dismissed it as sunlight catching the window at an odd angle, but Sarah knew better. The translucent, crystalline form trying to blend in with the modern art installation was doing a spectacularly poor job of it, especially since its internal organs kept changing colors every time she adjusted her wool scarf. Really subtle, she muttered into her pumpkin spice latte, watching as the being's central core shifted from a peaceful blue to an alarmed magenta when she removed her jacket. The temperature in the coffee shop had grown too warm, a common issue during the seasonal transition when buildings hadn't quite figured out their heating settings. The crystalline entity's reaction was almost comical. Its observation appendages, something between eyes and scanning arrays, widened, and Sarah could have sworn she saw it making notes on some kind of transparent tablet. She'd read about these beings in theoretical xenobiology texts. The crystalline confederation, a species so advanced they'd achieved interstellar travel, yet so set in their ways that they never changed their protective outer shell. Sarah took another sip of her coffee, using the motion to observe her observer. The being's shell was beautiful, she had to admit. It refracted light like a diamond, but moved with the fluidity of water. Complex mathematical patterns traced their way across its surface, probably some form of written language or personal identification. A group of freshmen walked past her table, their chatter filling the coffee shop. One of them had clearly just come from a morning run, still in exercise gear, while another was bundled up for winter despite the mild weather. The crystalline being's note-taking reached frantic levels. Fascinating. Sarah heard it whisper in perfect English, though the sound seemed to resonate from its entire form rather than any specific part. Multiple specimens displaying varying degrees of shell modification within the same social group. Possible indication of social hierarchy or thermal regulation deficiency. She couldn't help but smile. How strange human clothing must seem to a species that lived their entire lives in one protective layer. The being's confusion reminded her of her first conference presentation, where she'd argued that alien life might find Earth's biodiversity overwhelming, not because of the number of species, but because of how much each species, especially humans, could change their appearance. The crystalline entity shifted slightly, its surface catching the morning light in a way that nearly blinded a barista. Sarah watched as it quickly adjusted its density to become more opaque, apparently remembering some kind of protocol about remaining inconspicuous. Subject appears to be aware of observation. The being muttered to itself, its internal colors swirling in what Sarah interpreted as embarrassment. Recommend tactical retreat or, Sarah said loudly enough for the being to hear, you could join me for coffee and ask your questions directly. Though I should warn you, if you're really interested in human clothing, you've picked the wrong season to study us. Wait until spring, when everyone panic buys an entirely new wardrobe because they've convinced themselves nothing from last year fits. The crystalline being froze, its surface becoming so still, it truly did look like part of the art installation. Several long seconds passed as its internal colors cycled through what must have been the entire visible spectrum. Finally, in a tone that somehow managed to convey both scientific dignity and complete mortification, it spoke. I would like to know more about this concept of panic buying. For research purposes, of course. Sarah grinned and pulled out the chair across from her. Of course. Purely academic interest. I'm Dr. Sarah Miller, and you are. Designation ZIX 427. Xenoanthropologist 3rd class, currently experiencing what my species refers to as maximum professional embarrassment. Well, ZIX 427. Sarah said, already thinking about how this would change every theory in her field. Let me tell you about something we call Fashion Week. 3 days into their impromptu cultural exchange, Sarah found herself leading a very nervous crystalline xenoanthropologist through the halls of Harvard's biology department. Zix 427 had insisted on documenting every piece of clothing they encountered, which made the 10-minute walk from the coffee shop take nearly an hour. But the chemical composition appears identical, Zix 427 said, their internal colors swirling in confusion as they scanned yet another student's outfit. Why does this human's outer layer generate such different social responses than the previous one? Sarah glanced at the 2 students in question, one wearing a designer suit for a presentation, the other in a worn-out sweatsuit. That's because it's not about the basic materials, she explained, guiding her alien friend past a group of staring undergrads. It's about context, style, and social signals. Fascinating. Zix 427's crystal surface rippled with interest. In my species, our shells are purely functional. The only variations are those we're born with. They paused, internal lights dimming slightly. Though I must admit, some of us have begun to question this limitation. Sarah stopped outside her office door, intrigued by this hint of cultural dissent. Really, I thought the Crystalline Confederation was united in their traditions. We are, mostly. Zix 427's voice resonated with a note of hesitation. But after discovering other species, particularly humans, some of our younger generation have started to ask questions. Why must our shells remain unchanged? Could we not benefit from adaptation? Inside her office, Sarah watched as Zix 427 became transfixed by her wall of degrees and certificates, not by the achievements they represented, but by the various frames she'd chosen for each one. Even your information displays have exchangeable outer layers. They marveled, their surface patterns shifting in what Sarah had come to recognize as excitement. Here, Sarah said, making a decision. She shrugged off her blazer and held it out. Would you like to try it? Zix 427's entire form went rigid. That would be highly irregular. My research protocols. Sometimes the best research requires hands-on experience, Sarah pointed out, still holding the blazer. How can you truly understand why we change our outer layers without experiencing it yourself? The internal colors in Zix 427's form began cycling rapidly. Purple for anxiety, green for curiosity, blue for scientific interest. Finally, with a sound like wind chimes in a breeze, they'd reached out with an appendage that shifted to match the texture of the fabric. I cannot actually wear it, they admitted, touching the blazer gently. But I can analyze its properties this way. Their voice took on a tone of wonder. It's so different from our shells. Lighter, more flexible, yet still providing protection and temperature regulation. And you say you have multiple versions of these. Sarah walked to her office closet and opened it, revealing a collection of professional and casual wear. We call it a wardrobe. Each piece serves different purposes: professional presentations, casual meetings, laboratory work, special occasions. Zix 427's note-taking reached new speeds. But how do you choose? The combinations seem infinite. That's part of the fun, Sarah said, then noticed something odd. As Zix 427 examined her closet, their usually pristine surface had developed a small pattern that looked remarkably like a pinstripe suit. Zix, your shell is changing. The alien froze, their colors shifting to alarmed red. Impossible. Our shells are permanent. They don't. They caught their reflection in Sarah's office window, and their voice trailed off. Oh dear. This is unprecedented. Sarah leaned forward, her scientific curiosity fully engaged. Is this normal for your species? No, Zix 427 whispered, their voice a mix of terror and fascination. No one in the Confederation has ever. We're not supposed to be able to. Just then, Sarah's office door burst open as her department head walked in, talking before he even looked up. "Dr. Miller, about your latest research proposal." He stopped dead, staring at the crystalline being with the distinctly business-casual pattern spreading across their surface. "Ah," Sarah said into the awkward silence. "I can explain this." 3 hours of explanations, and one very hastily arranged non-disclosure agreement later, Sarah found herself standing outside the Burlington Mall with a still flustered Zix 427. The crystalline being had managed to suppress their accidental pattern change, though occasional pinstripes still flickered across their surface when they got excited. "Are you certain this is necessary?" Zix 427 asked, their form shimmering with anxiety as they watched humans stream in and out of the building. The department head seemed quite insistent about keeping a low profile. Sarah adjusted her sunglasses, grinning. "Trust me, the mall is perfect. Where else can you study human clothing culture in its natural habitat? Besides, at this point, everyone will just assume you're an interactive art installation." As they entered through the main doors, Zix 427's internal colors shifted to an overwhelmed purple. The vast space before them was a cathedral of commerce, filled with displays of every type of human clothing imaginable. "Processing error," Zix 427 mumbled, their note-taking appendage twitching. "Too many variables. Are those small humans wearing replicas of large predatory animals?" Sarah followed their gaze to a group of kids in dinosaur hoodies. "Those are just costumes. Humans like to dress up as other things sometimes. It's part of how we express ourselves." Expression through deliberate misrepresentation. Fascinating. Their voice dropped to a whisper. "But why is that adult human wearing something called Crocs with what you explained are formal business attire?" Actually, I can't explain that one. Some things in human fashion just defy scientific analysis." They made their way through the mall, with Sarah having to repeatedly prevent Zix 427 from absorbing fabric samples into their crystal matrix for analysis. The alien was particularly fascinated by the concept of shopping sales, watching in horror as two grandmothers engaged in a polite but intense negotiation over the last discounted cashmere sweater. "Is this ritual combat?" they asked, recording the interaction. "Should we intervene?" "No, this is actually them being civil. You should see what happens on Black Friday." Their journey hit a snag when they reached the fitting rooms. Zix 427 became absolutely transfixed by the concept of a space dedicated to outer layer exchange. "So humans require special chambers for their molting process?" they asked, attracting strange looks from a group of teenagers. "It's not molting, it's just trying things on," Sarah explained, steering them away from the increasingly curious store staff. "And speaking of trying things," she held up a crystal-patterned scarf she'd been hiding behind her back. Zix 427's form went almost completely transparent in surprise. This is an attempt to mimic our crystal formation patterns," they said, their voice filled with wonder. "Humans create artificial shells that look like other species. We find beauty in a lot of things," Sarah said, wrapping the scarf around her neck. "Sometimes we like to celebrate that through what we wear." Something changed in Zix 427's demeanor. Their surface rippled, and slowly, deliberately, a pattern began to form. Not the accidental pinstripes from earlier, but a careful recreation of the scarf's design. They started, then stopped as a small crowd of amazed onlookers began to gather. "Dr. Miller, I believe we should exit this facility immediately." Sarah quickly paid for the scarf, and they made their way to the exit, followed by whispers and the occasional photo snap. Once outside, Zix 427's pattern faded, but they remained unusually quiet. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked as they walked to her car. "I know that was a lot to process." "I have made a significant discovery," Zix 427 said finally, their tone serious. "One that could change everything for my species, but I don't know if we're ready for it." "What discovery?" "Our shells. They're not actually permanent. We've just forgotten how to change." They turned to Sarah, their surface showing a complex mix of colors she'd never seen before. "And I think humans might be the key to remembering." Sarah's university lab had never seen anything quite like this. At 3 in the morning, the usually quiet space hummed with activity as she and Zix 427 pored over ancient crystalline historical records, projected in shimmering holograms above her workstation. "There," Zix 427 said, their form glowing with excitement. "That text fragment from our first age. Look at the patterns in their shells." Sarah leaned forward, squinting at the image of ancient crystalline beings. Unlike modern members of their species, these ancestors showed dramatic variations in their shell patterns, swirls, geometric shapes, and colors that shifted with clear purpose. "They're like mood rings," she muttered, then caught herself. "Sorry, Earth reference. But look at this." Their shells were responding to their environment, their emotions, maybe even their social status. What changed? Zix 427's colors dimmed to a troubled blue. The Great Stabilization. Our history speaks of a time when our planet faced catastrophic environmental changes. Our leaders believed that by standardizing our shells, making them permanent and unchanging, we could better survive the crisis. Did it work? For a time. They projected another image. Their homeworld, once a vibrant crystal paradise, now showing signs of severe degradation. But our environment continued to change. Now our rigid shells, the very adaptation that saved us, are becoming a liability. We can't adjust fast enough. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing. But today at the mall, you changed your shell pattern. You adapted. Yes, but it was instinctive, uncontrolled. And they hesitated, their surface rippling with anxiety. It's forbidden. The Confederation believes that changing our shells would mean losing our identity, our culture. Sarah stood up and began pacing, a habit that had gotten her through many scientific breakthroughs. But what if it's the opposite? What if the ability to change is actually your species' true nature? Look at humans. We change our appearance constantly, but we don't lose who we are. She grabbed her lab coat from its hook and pulled it on. When I put this on, I'm still Dr. Sarah Miller. But now I'm Dr. Miller in research mode. When I put on a dress for a conference, I'm Dr. Miller presenting. When I'm in my pajamas at home, I'm just Sarah. Different layers, same person. Zix 427's surface began to shift, almost unconsciously, taking on the texture of lab coat material. But our council, they would never accept such a radical change in philosophy. Maybe they don't have to, not right away. Sarah pulled out her research tablet. What if we could prove that controlled shell modification is possible? Show them it's not a loss of identity, but a return to your species' original adaptability. She pulled up some files from her earlier research on crystal formation and growth. Look at this. If we combine what we know about human fabric technology with your species' natural crystal properties. Dr. Miller, Zix 427 interrupted, their voice unusually serious. What you're suggesting? It would be more than just research. It would be a revolution. Sometimes the best science is revolutionary, Sarah replied, already starting to sketch out experimental protocols. Besides, Earth's history is full of fashion revolutions. Why should your species be any different? Just then, both of their phones buzzed simultaneously. Sarah checked hers and felt her heart skip a beat. It was an alert from the Planetary Defense Network. A massive solar storm was approaching, one that could devastate both human technology and crystalline biology. "Well," she said, looking at her alien friend whose surface had gone almost completely clear with shock, "I guess we're about to run our first experiment under real-world conditions. How do you feel about rapid prototyping?" Zix-427's surface slowly began to solidify, taking on a pattern that looked remarkably like a determined expression. "As you humans say, let's make it work." Sarah grinned and pulled up her research database. "Then let's show the universe what happens when human fashion sense meets crystalline engineering. First step, we need to figure out how to make your equivalent of a lab coat." The lab had become a peculiar hybrid of high-fashion workshop and advanced physics laboratory. Holographic fabric patterns floated beside crystal structure diagrams, while prototype shell modifications glittered under specialized testing equipment. Sarah had called in every favor. She had to keep the building empty, but they were still racing against time. "The molecular binding is still unstable," Zix-427 said, their surface flickering with frustration as another test sample shattered. "We're missing something fundamental about how your fabrics adapt to stress." Sarah brushed crystal fragments off her lab coat, her eyes red from 48 hours of non-stop work. "Maybe we're thinking about this wrong. We keep trying to make your crystal structure behave like fabric. But what if?" She pulled up the latest scan of Zix-427's shell pattern from the mall incident. "Look at this. When you changed naturally, your crystal matrix didn't actually become softer. It created microscopic layers that could slide past each other. Like the weave in your clothing," Zix-427 realized, their colors brightening. "But our traditional engineering would never consider such a solution. We've always valued perfect structural unity." "Sometimes strength comes from flexibility," Sarah said, already modifying their testing parameters. "Let's try something new. Instead of changing your entire shell structure, what if we created a secondary layer, like a crystal jacket?" The next few hours were a blur of calculations, failed attempts, and increasingly creative Earth metaphors, as Sarah tried to explain concepts like stretched jeans and breaking in new shoes to her crystalline friend. "I still don't understand how deliberately wearing uncomfortable footwear relates to adaptation," Zix-427 said, carefully manipulating a promising crystal formation. "Trust me, if humans can master the art of high heels, your species can handle flexible crystal shells," Sarah replied, then froze as her computer started blaring alerts. "The solar storm. It's accelerating. We've got less than 6 hours." Zix-427's surface went almost completely transparent, their version of turning pale. Not enough time. The calculations alone would take. "No more calculations," Sarah interrupted, standing up. "We need to test this now. On you." "That would violate every research protocol." "Protocol isn't going to save either of our species," Sarah said, pulling up the latest prototype design. "Look, the basic theory is sound. Your natural ability to change is still there. We just need to wake it up. Give it a pattern to follow." She held up the crystal-patterned scarf from the mall. "This triggered a response before. If we use it as a template, combined with the layered crystal structure we've developed." Zix-427 studied the design, their colors shifting through shades of doubt and hope. "The risk of catastrophic shell failure is less than the risk of doing nothing," Sarah finished. She placed her hand against their crystal surface. "I know it's scary. Humans feel the same way about trying new styles. But sometimes you have to take a fashion risk to find your true self." A sound like crystal wind chimes filled the lab, Zix-427's version of laughter. "You relate everything to fashion, don't you? Hey, it works. Look at your surface. Where Sarah's hand touched the crystal shell, subtle patterns had begun to form, like ripples in a pond. Zix 427 stared in wonder as the design spread, their entire form beginning to shimmer with new possibilities. "That's it," Sarah breathed, already running scans. "Your shell remembers. It just needed a little human inspiration." "Then let's complete the experiment," Zix 427 said, their voice firm despite their swirling colors of nervousness. "If we're going to break every rule in both our species' scientific books, we might as well do it in style." Sarah grinned and started the final protocol sequence. "That's the spirit. Now, let's give you the galaxy's first crystal makeover. And if we're lucky, we might just save both our worlds in the process." As the lab equipment hummed to life around them, neither scientist noticed the small drone outside the window, its crystalline lens recording everything for a very interested Confederation Council. The holographic projection of the Confederation Council filled Sarah's lab, turning the cluttered space into an impromptu courtroom. 12 crystalline elders, their shells rigid with traditional patterns, stared down at Sarah and Zix 427. The latter's new adaptable shell layer shimmed defiantly, displaying a complex pattern that matched Sarah's lab coat. "Researcher Zix 427. The chief elder's voice resonated through the room. "You stand accused of violating our most sacred laws. Explain your actions." Sarah started to step forward, but Zix 427 moved first, their new shell configuration catching the light in ways that made several council members gasp. "Honored elders," they began, "what you see is not a violation of our nature, but a return to it. Dr. Miller and I have discovered something remarkable in human adaptation patterns." They projected the historical records they'd found, showing their ancient ancestors changing shells. "We were never meant to be static. Our current form is not our true heritage, but a response to a crisis long past." The council chamber erupted in murmurs. Sarah watched as the younger council members leaned forward, their colors showing interest despite their attempts to maintain proper decorum. "And this human," another elder spoke, gesturing to Sarah, "she convinced you to abandon our ways." "Actually," Sarah said, unable to stay quiet, "your ways already include adaptation. Every crystal formation on your homeworld responds to its environment. Your ships adjust their crystal matrices for space travel. Why should your people be the only things that don't change?" She pulled up the latest solar storm data on her screens. "And right now, we don't have time for a philosophical debate. That storm will hit both our worlds in less than 4 hours. But what we've developed here isn't just a fashion statement. It's a survival mechanism." Zix 427 demonstrated, their new shell layer shifting to display various protective configurations. The same principles that allow humans to adapt their clothing to different environments have helped us unlock our natural abilities. We can create shells that respond to threats while maintaining our core identity. "Our identity is our constancy," the chief elder insisted, but there was a note of uncertainty in their tone. "No," Zix 427 said firmly, "our identity is our ability to persist through change. Look at humans. They change their outer layers constantly, yet remain distinctly human. In fact, it's part of what makes them human." Sarah added, "Your species' greatest strength was never your rigidity. It was your ability to adapt. We haven't changed your nature. We've just helped you remember it." A young council member suddenly spoke up, their shell showing traces of unauthorized pattern shifts. "The ancient texts speak of the time before the Great Stabilization. They say our ancestors could dance with the stars themselves, their shells reflecting the beauty of the cosmos. And we can again," Zix 427 said, their voice filled with hope. "But first, we need to survive this storm. The choice is yours, honored elders. Cling to rigid tradition and risk everything, or embrace change and save our people." The council chamber fell silent. Sarah held her breath, watching the play of colors and patterns across the Elder shells. Even in their supposedly fixed state, she could see subtle shifts, their natural adaptability fighting through centuries of suppression. Finally, the Chief Elder spoke again. "The storm approaches. Show us how to change." Sarah grinned as Zix-427's colors blazed with joy. "Well," she said, pulling up their research data, "let's start with something simple. Think of it as your species' first fashion show." As they began the emergency training session, teaching ancient crystal beings how to find their flexibility again, Sarah couldn't help but think that sometimes the most important scientific breakthroughs really did come down to a simple change of clothes. Outside, the sky was beginning to shimmer with the first signs of the solar storm, but inside the lab, a different kind of shimmer was spreading. One of hope, change, and the universe's most unusual fashion revolution. The sky above Harvard had turned an impossible shade of green as the solar storm's leading edge began to interact with Earth's magnetic field. Inside the lab, Sarah and Zix-427 were leading the most unusual emergency response team ever assembled. A group of crystalline beings learning to change their shells while human scientists monitored the approaching storm. "Remember," Sarah called out, her voice steady despite the growing static in the air. "Think of it like layers. You're not losing your core structure, you're adding protection. Just like how we add coats in winter." The human metaphor is surprisingly effective, one of the younger council members said, their shell successfully shifting to display a protective pattern. "Though I still don't understand why you have something called Casual Friday." "Focus, please," Zix-427 interrupted, their own shell demonstrating the correct configuration. "The storm's magnetic interference will hit in 17 minutes. Everyone needs to master at least the basic shield pattern." Sarah checked the latest readings and felt her heart skip. "Make that 12 minutes. The storm's accelerating." The lab erupted in a chorus of crystal chimes as the aliens redoubled their efforts. Some were adapting quickly, their shells shifting with growing confidence. Others struggled, centuries of rigid tradition fighting against their natural adaptability. "It's not working fast enough," the Chief Elder said, their own shell showing only minor changes. "Perhaps we should evacuate. Return to our ships." "No time," Sarah said, running new calculations. "The storm would tear your ships apart before you reached orbit. We need—" She paused. "An idea striking. We need to work together. Zix, remember them all. How you first changed." Zix-427's colors shifted in recognition. The scarf pattern. Seeing human design triggered something. "Exactly." Sarah turned to the assembled beings. "Stop trying to force the change. Look at us. Look at how we adapt. Use our patterns as a template." She grabbed lab coats, scarves, even her emergency rain gear from her office, spreading them out. Each of these serves a purpose: protection, identification, adaptation. Your shells can do the same. The crystalline beings gathered around the display of human clothing. Slowly, like a wave-building force, their shells began to change. Patterns spread from one to another, each adding their own variations, creating a cascade of crystal innovation. Remarkable. The Chief Elder breathed, their own shell finally beginning to shift. "It's like remembering a song we'd forgotten we knew." A warning alarm blared through the lab. 8 minutes, Sarah announced, then noticed something on her screens. "Wait, look at this." The combined effect of multiple crystalline beings changing their shells had created an unexpected phenomenon. The patterns weren't just protecting individual beings. They were synchronizing, creating a larger, more complex defense matrix. "Of course," Zix-427 exclaimed, their colors bright with realization. Just like your human fashion creates cultural movements, our changes can work together. Quick, everyone join shells. The crystalline beings moved together, their modified shells linking patterns until the lab was filled with a dazzling display of synchronized crystal matrices. Sarah's instruments were going wild, recording energy levels she'd never seen before. The storm's hitting. Someone shouted as the first wave of magnetic interference slammed into Earth's atmosphere. Sarah watched in awe as the combined crystal shield pattern held, then strengthened, then began to spread. Through her lab's windows, she could see the protection extending beyond the building, beyond the campus, a shimmering dome of crystal energy rising to meet the storm. "It's working," she whispered. Then louder, "It's working. The shield is actually deflecting the solar energy." Zix 427 moved to her side, their shell now displaying a pattern that somehow managed to look both professional and triumphant. "We did more than save ourselves, Dr. Miller. Look, the shield is protecting your world too." Above them, the green sky was being pushed back by a crystal aurora, as beautiful as any fashion show and as practical as a raincoat. Human science and crystalline adaptation had created something entirely new, and just maybe changed both their worlds forever. 1 month after the great solar storm, Sarah found herself standing on a stage at the Galactic Scientific Council, wearing what had to be the most unique academic regalia in human history. Her traditional doctoral robes had been complemented by a crystalline overlay, a gift from the Confederation, that shimmed with every movement. "In conclusion," she said, addressing the mixed audience of humans and crystalline beings, "the events of last month proved more than just our ability to survive a solar storm. They demonstrated the power of cultural exchange, of learning to see ourselves through others' eyes." The audience sparkled. Literally, in the case of the crystalline members, many of whom now sported adaptable shell layers in various Earth-inspired patterns. Some had even started experimenting with what they called seasonal collections. Dr. Miller's contribution to our society cannot be overstated, Zix 427 added from their position next to her. Their shell now displayed a complex pattern that somehow managed to look like a perfect blend of traditional crystalline formal wear and a well-tailored Earth suit. By helping us rediscover our adaptive nature, she has not only saved lives, but revolutionized our understanding of ourselves. In the front row, the chief elder, their shell now sporting a subtle but distinct pattern that changed with their moods, nodded approvingly. The recent changes had been especially popular among the younger generation, who had embraced the ability to express themselves through their shells with unprecedented enthusiasm. But perhaps the most significant discovery, Sarah continued, was learning that adaptation doesn't mean losing identity. It means growing into a fuller version of who you are. She gestured to the screen behind her, showing images of the new Crystal Human Research Institute being built in Cambridge, which is why I'm pleased to announce our next project. The screen displayed designs for a new type of spacesuit, one that combined human engineering with crystalline adaptive technology. By merging our understanding of flexible protection, we're creating solutions that neither of our species could have developed alone. After the presentation, during the reception, Sarah found a quiet moment with Zix 427 in the garden outside the council chamber. The evening sky was beautiful, stars twinkling through the protective crystal dome that now encased much of the research campus, a permanent memorial to their collaboration. "You know," Sarah said, adjusting her crystal-enhanced robes, "when I first saw you trying to hide behind that coffee shop art installation, I never imagined we'd end up here." Zix 427's surface rippled with amusement. "And I never imagined I would become what my people are calling a fashion icon. Though I still don't understand why some humans insist on wearing socks with sandals. Trust me, that baffles most humans too." Sarah watched as a group of young crystalline students passed by, their shelves displaying everything from classical earth art patterns to abstract crystalline designs. Your people have adapted to these changes better than anyone expected. Perhaps because we were ready for change, Zix 427 replied, their pattern shifting to a more contemplative configuration. Sometimes the greatest discoveries come from simply giving ourselves permission to be different. A soft chime sounded, indicating the start of the evening's main event. Sarah grinned. Speaking of different, are you ready for this? The first interspecies fashion show. I've been practicing my runway walk, as you suggested, though I still think the term fierce is oddly aggressive for a display of decorative outer layers. Together, they headed back inside, where the council chamber had been transformed into a runway. Human models in crystal-enhanced clothing would walk alongside crystalline beings displaying their new adaptive patterns, a living symbol of how far both species had come. As they took their places, Sarah couldn't help but smile at the thought that sometimes the greatest scientific breakthroughs came not from complex equations or advanced technology, but from something as simple as learning to change your clothes. Above them, through the crystal dome, a shooting star traced a path across the sky, its light reflecting off 1,000 changing shells, each one telling a story of adaptation, growth, and the beautiful complexity of being alive in a universe full of possibilities.